Okay, so continuing on, the next section or the next chapter of the first section, and the first section is general, what do we call it? I don't know what we called it. General revelations of the politician. So, the journey from Plato's Republic to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is the final section of the first chapter, or last chapter of the first section, however you want to look at it. Here we will retouch on the purpose of this great manifesto that you are now deep in. It should be understood that as aspiring politicians or politicians in their own right, the readers of this book are being trained to be, or at least be aware of, guardians of a proposed republic. The structure of that republic is yet to be determined, as the idea around building a constitution of sorts is daunting, and the author himself does not have the resources, financial capabilities, or connections to organize a convention to make a new constitution or anything like it, and does not want to overthrow governments or anything of the like. The author does, however, want to start a new world republic, one which is built on the foundations of an emphasis on political knowledge and understanding. Hopefully this book serves to entice individuals to rise up and speak with one another cordially in a way that promotes the betterment of society. So after having created the guardians or politicians, or those who serve the republic, the next step is to instill the Leviathan, the leader, or group of leaders who will rule our republic, and that is where pragmatic knowledge must be incorporated into the minds of our guardians. Factual knowledge must be attained, and although the author's opinion will be given in like fashion as what has preceded this chapter, some actual facts about the functioning of government follows. Granted, the rest of the book is not all factual, and much revolves around spiritual significances and subjective quandaries and exploration, but knowledge is being passed from the author to the reader nonetheless. The reader will notice that the next section is on general government and goes into detail about the functioning of the United States government and gives revelations pertaining to structural features provided by the Constitution. Bear in mind that the third great part of this book revolves solely around the Constitution, the United States Constitution. If the reader enjoys the more philosophical approach and reasoning for why certain political philosophies are more aligned with seeking goodness for all, then the second great part will be more intriguing. However, in keeping with Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, a grand component of this first great part will be about God, specifically the God of Abraham, and will go into detail as if it were a factual entity as the author believes them to be. If you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, you would understand why I say this. Reading Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan will quickly make known how religious that book is, and though the author does not quote scripture in this book, the similarities are there. And with keeping with Plato's The Republic and in building guardians, make it known that a large part of general government revelations is devoted to war and war conduct. Okay, so this part is called general government revelations. The first part was general political revelations. This is general government revelations. The content of the author's notebook includes many copied texts relating to politics. This political rhetoric comes from varying sources, including both the National Constitution Center and the White House. There are a multitude of purposes for copying political text, most notably to learn the material that is being transcribed. The information included can be used to form grand ideas, and the possibility for critical thinking is great. It is important to note when reading this book that although things are set in the Constitution to be black and white in interpretation, there are also complexities and nuances throughout. So the first section of this part is general forms of government. Here, the United States government is used as an example of a general form of government. There are various other forms of government in the United States Constitution. Creating this government will be discussed in detail in the third great part, which will revolve solely around the Constitution, its articles, sections, clauses, and all of the amendments. The United States Constitution outlines 3 branches of government, having powers that induce a system of checks and balances. The president has the power to veto legislation presented to him or her by Congress, as well as the ability to nominate the heads of federal agencies. Congress has the power to reject or accept the president's nominations, as well as the ability to impeach the president. The Supreme Court can reject and tear down unconstitutional laws, and the justices who sit on the court are nominated by the President and then confirmed by the Senate. There are a multitude of ways that a law or laws can be enacted. One possibility is in an executive order by the President, as well as memoranda and proclamations. However, legislative action primarily begins with the Congress, as they are the main component of the legislative branch. The legislative branch of the United States government is constituted as a bicameral Congress consisting of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House is larger in proportion based on the population of the states, while the Senate is proportioned equally among each of the states. It is made obvious that the House of Representatives is more susceptible to the sway of political ideals and norms than the Senate is. Also, based on how representation is proportioned between the Senate and the House of Representatives, all being equal, a senator has more political power than a member of the House of Representatives. However, depending on which committees they are part of and the influence held by the member of Congress, whether chamber they are in is irrelevant. The legislative branch of government is also responsible for numerous agencies whose work supports the members of Congress, such as the Congressional Budget Office, Library of Congress, and the United States Capitol Police. The executive branch is by far the largest branch of the United States government and is comprised of millions of members and employees. The executive branch is committed to executing the laws of the United States, which includes carrying out the day-to-day functions of the government and enforcing the laws. The executive branch is primarily comprised of the executive office of the president, executive departments, sub-agencies and bureaus, independent agencies, boards, commissions, committees, and quasi-official agencies, and the military. The judicial branch of the United States government consists of the Supreme Court, federal courts, judicial agencies, and minor agencies dedicated to the confirmation of judges and justices. The purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret the meaning of laws, the validity of laws, and how laws apply to individual cases. The following is a simplification of the steps included in preparing and enacting laws through Congress. First, a bill is introduced in either house, then the bill is delegated to a committee, which conducts research and modifies the bill. Following this first modification, the bill is voted on by the originating house and is then sent to the other house for the same modification and voting procedures. Once both chambers of Congress have voted to pass a bill, they must create a matching version amongst them. Then it is sent to the President for approval. The President either signs the bill into law or sends it back to Congress for reevaluation. Of course, it is interesting to note that almost every bill is reviewed by the federal courts for constitutionality. There are 4 varying forms that a legislative bill can take: bills, joint resolutions, concurrent resolutions, and simple resolutions. All of these are similar but differ in some practicalities. The budget of the United States varies slightly in its enactment from a typical legislative bill. Congress prepares a federal budget for the next year annually. However, this process largely begins in the executive branch, where agencies and departments submit budget requests to the White House. Then, after gathering all the relevant information, the President creates a budget proposal and sends it off to Congress. Before beginning to understand the complicated role of Congress in validating the United States budget, it's important to familiarize oneself with the 3 different areas of funding. These include discretionary funding, interest on debt, and mandatory spending. Discretionary funding is that which provides for federal agencies and is set annually by Congress, whereas mandatory spending provides for other spending legally required, such as Medicare. For programs and agencies to acquire financial support from the United States government, authorization bills must be created, changed, and passed by congressional committees, as well as signed by the President. Those programs that do not have authorized authority do not get appropriated funds. These appropriated funds for approved programs and agencies can develop at any time throughout the year and are reevaluated or permanently implemented on their own schedule. However, the largest financing of the United States government in relation to Congress begins when a budget resolution is passed. Each chamber of Congress creates its own budget resolution, only to have it merged with the other so that a unique and identical resolution is proposed and passed by both houses. Part of this budget resolution and being prepared concurrently are appropriation bills. These are created, researched, and proposed by appropriations committees in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The process includes interviewing and gathering information from the leaders of federal agencies. There are 2 different reasons for authorization laws to be enacted. They create and make changes to federal programs that require the government's financial support, and they are required by Senate and House Representatives rules and regulations. Direct spending by authorization laws is considered mandatory and includes the larger portion of entitlement programs, such as Social Security. Typically, mandatory or direct spending is set in stone and does not change, but there are certain programs that require periodic renewal processes. Discretionary spending is different from direct and or mandatory spending in that it is considered and provided for by 12 separate appropriations acts. The appropriate amounts of spending by the appropriations acts are guided by the appropriations committees of both the United States Senate and House of Representatives. There are both definite and indefinite authorizations depending on the nature of the funding required. It is quite possible for an authorization to be permanent, but many need to be modified every year annually. Reauthorization is considered by Congress on a case-to-case basis. Unauthorized appropriations are those made after an appropriation has expired. The House of Representatives and the Senate have different procedures when dealing with unauthorized appropriations present in proposed legislation. Okay, so that's just a precursor to what a lot of the book is about. On the state of the world, the next section. In 2026, things are relatively terrifying, as an optimist would see it. And again, the book's not finished. It's about 30% done. In 2026, things are relatively terrifying. As an optimist would see it, the state of the world was considerably moderate, and the world was lacking in major wars except for in Israel and Ukraine and other troublesome areas in which conflict was common. The United States committed a series of bombardments and airstrikes on Iran, even killing its supreme leader. This has moved the world into a place of conflict. All around the world, people are more consumed with news of world events, and the situation in the Middle East has only exacerbated the problem. In recent years, Israel has been decimating the occupied territory of the Gaza Strip and was receiving harsh criticism from nations around the world, experiencing support only from civilizations such as the United States of America. Now, both the United States and Israel have significantly destroyed much of the military capabilities of Iran, Iran having a new leader already in control of them, and bombing adversaries elsewhere. The Trump administration seemed to be slightly over its head and not completely in control of the situation, but this is only speculation. Hezbollah is being attacked in Lebanon, and ground operations are being performed by Israel in that location. Iran is targeting almost indiscriminately many surrounding nations in the Middle East, and it would seem from a common observation that many American citizens do not even know where Iran is located on a map. Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, all invaded or attacked by the United States since the turn of the century, lie in adjacency to one another and are not necessarily in the main portion of the Middle East, but are placed north of bodies of water, separating them from the Arabian Peninsula. The significance of the fall of the Iranian regime and the death of its leader has enormous implications for the area of the Middle East, especially in the United States. This seems to be largely underestimated. The supreme leader of Iran had been in control of that country for well over 30 years, and Iran has been the backer of many terrorist organizations and proxy factions throughout the whole of the region. They were a sophisticated nation with institutionalized military and economic capabilities that held the status quo of the Middle East in order. Iran is the hub of the Shiite community and an adversary of both Saudi Arabia and the larger Arabian Peninsula, and the destruction of Israel is codified in its constitution. Areas such as Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip have the support of Iran, and the killing of its supreme leader has uncountable consequences and implications that will likely play out in years to come, as fighting in the Middle East and bombing do not look likely to cease anytime in the immediate future. This is just one specific area of the globe. Expanding outward, and more generally speaking, we see the following, where humanity lives in a very complex period of history in which heads of state run rampant with power, wealthy individuals have extraordinary wealth, and technology seems to be progressing more quickly than anyone would dare conceive. The absurdly quick progression of all facets of technology has led to confusion and disarray among most members of the world population, and this has obviously been driven by advancements in artificial intelligence, which has led to advancements in other industries, all of which has led to tons of information about products and innovations being distributed among the world population rapidly. It is a fact that screens, including those of computers, phones, and televisions, perform dynamic tasks that did not even exist 5 to 10 years ago and far surpassed the capabilities of 20 years ago. All of these devices and more are connected through the internet, which then connects all of the users for not so seamless personal information sharing and completely seamless non-personal information sharing. Put another way, this is true regarding personal and impersonal communications. The primary concern is the transfer and manipulation of information and data but also the new and dramatic ways in which communication between individuals and the masses is carried out. Information technologies allow for large amounts of data on individuals and groups to be stored and used to further progress more information technologies, which allow businesses and other entities to make more profits. The government does not store massive amounts of information about individuals, but the true weight of data storage and manipulative contriving lies with the companies that are seeking to increase financially. These corporations and companies have been successful, which in turn has allowed owners of businesses, company presidents, stockholders, and extended stakeholders to make more money, and unless an individual is invested in such, they do not make gains. The improvement of personal communication technology through applications that provide unique ways of communicating, such as through picture sharing and news sharing, has extended the way networking is performed. Fame is gathered and current events are shared. This has led to world leaders, especially the prominent ones, gaining more power thanks to bias and strategic public relations efforts. The information technology advancements in other industries relating to cybersecurity and monitoring have allowed all leaders to centralize and expand their power. Next is power structures of government. There are black hole-like vacuums of power that appear when the need for power through coercion exists. In most of the world, the need for having individuals in power is solved by the formation of governments, and in those governments, power is given to those in charge. And sometimes power is spread across branches of government, as is the case in the United States, and sometimes it is concentrated in a pillar-like structure, always dependent on the framework for government in place. Also, political parties exist in almost every government, and these political parties hold power of the foundation of that government. What are the effects of having one dominant political party, like in China, Russia, and North Korea, or two political parties that exchange control of the executive, as is possible in the United States, or for example, Germany? Or the effects of having three or more dominant political parties, as is sometimes seen in the United Kingdom, France, and Israel? Power can be spread, manipulated, and shared, depending on structures that create the ability for power to exist, such as a constitution. Usually, this constitution will either include political party control or a lack thereof, and this can change the trajectory of nations and determine which individuals will control political power. Further, the division of power set by the Constitution with any checks or balances between branches or groupings of government must be accounted for in the layout of power formations in government, meaning often there are checks and balances on which political parties and dominant heads of political parties control power in the various sectors of the government. The number of dominant political parties is dependent on the influence parties have on governing entities and how party officials exist and cooperate with elected or appointed public officials. It seems, It seems from observation that in the governing entities of today, which are divided by country borders, governing responsibility is created by the structure of the government, held by officials of the state, and exists in tandem with the coexisting realm of political parties. Political parties either follow or are followed by the officials of the state and can influence while existing simultaneously the power and action of those officials. And when the political party of a strong executive holds sway in the shadows of government, a point on the spectrum of dictatorship is placed. While similar power formations can exist in the United States, albeit sometimes fruitlessly when the population is split evenly, such as when a political party controls the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, no power vacuum reigns supreme like those in your standard communist nation, like China and North Korea. Now, that is not to say that communism has decimated these nations. The world may never know what alternative outcome may have come to be had communism not existed, and a nation such as Russia or other dictatorships or a theocracy experiences a similar phenomenon of a core power vacuum being filled by a single individual for extended periods of time. Taking a more rational approach, what are the benefits of a nation led by an executive who holds relatively ultimate authority over the whole nation, by association or creation of a communist party or similar? An obvious benefit is the creation of laws, which are easily passed and implemented, and another is the mobilization of large amounts of the population through the use of government institutions, and a method for governing that is protected by unanimous consent domestically and is recognized internationally as being unified. Most importantly, though, is the great ability to make decisive executive decisions quickly and efficiently in order to best implement and enforce policies. China is a good example of a country where there is a single political party enshrined in the constitution with a head of state. While this may seem like a dictatorship to some in Western societies, the head of the Communist Party, as well as officials on the provincial and local levels, are elected. And China has a largely free market where although state enterprises benefit and control of the economy is regulated, they enjoy the benefits that those under a more totalitarian dictatorship do not. They do, however, have some social constraints placed on them, pressuring them to apply set social norms and values. This does not take place in freer political spheres where power is less centralized. North Korea is the most apparent example of a supreme power holding sway over a singular political party, and Russia experiences a similar structure of a sovereign entity having ultimate political power. Although Russia disguises itself as a democracy, with opposition being able to flow freely, it is a free aristocratic dictatorship. It is a free aristocratic dictatorship which makes it a stepping stone into the democracy of Europe, but a democracy with no opposition all the same, even if their current leader wins through corruption and rigged voting. Anyway, Russia is unique and a stepping stone toward democracy also in that opposition and power against the executive lies in the legislature and courts, whereas the communist nation's opposition to the executive power lies in the political party that holds power as a whole. These are what Western societies call a totalitarian regime, where there is a pillar of political power, however complex and messy, that establishes one supreme leader to control the nation for extended periods of time. The bickering of local and sub-lead executive officials still persists, and the political process turns even in the most evil of totalitarian governments where corruption and violence flourish. Now, in many democracies and other nations, where power is decentralized by a constitution or other agreement of mutual trust, such as the United States or the nations of Europe, political hold on power is limited by time, and the exchange of ideals and values reigning supreme changes rapidly in contrast. The United States and Germany are excellent examples of democracies where political authority is held by political parties with a majority and an inherent opposing minority. Albeit Germany's is in the form of ruling coalitions, this exists when coalitions are formed in groupings of multiple dominant political parties, and it is even more short-lived as far as ruling, legislating, jurisprudence, etc. are concerned. The United States and Germany often mirror each other in political ideals and values, and have put heavy emphasis on economic and technological research and development through the benefits of a free market and focus on privatization, individual rights, and intellectual property. With two dominant political parties, the United States has established itself as the most blessed and greatest nation of all time. This is due to a further division of political power from a pillar-like structure to one divided between a majority and a minority. Luckily, the flexibility of having more than one political party and the tension of mutual agreement placed into one singular group is alleviated to allow for the current overextension of the executive branches currently being experienced in the free world. Add regular voting and term limits, and you have a truly free democracy. And the world seems to follow in the footsteps of the United States' most glorious experiment into liberty, freedom, and all Western values. But to experience the effects of having a dominant leader who can divvy out their responsibilities in the best manner, popular opinion has allowed for the United States president to have extreme executive authority through orders that are not challenged by either the legislature or the courts. This is a simple situation of democracy in a Republican form of government where the majority has outpoliticked the minority. However, when power is divided into a majority and a minority, the problems discovered by the ancient Greeks seem to resurface. The majority oppresses the minority, and when the majority consumes the institutional structures meant to protect the minority, corruption, populism, and hatred can thrive, and despotism will set in. Germany has somewhat of a notorious history of this, and nationalism as it exists in Western society seems to emanate from both of these nations. Modern Germany, though, is different from the United States, which is unique in its two-party system, in that there's a governing coalition and an opposing coalition, which implies that there is a changing of a multitude of political parties within Germany that work together to form a ruling majority. This is a case to argue that Germany belongs with most other countries, but can still be used as an example, and shows that a two-party system can be exemplified even when it is multiple parties split into two power divisions. Now, power is not simply divided between two groups in these nations, and in Germany, parties only associate harmoniously for the purpose of governing. But the constitution that creates the government is essential in determining the separation of powers and the checks and balances, the framework, or the doctrinal housing of the government. This accentuates the idea that political parties hold power both congruently and separately as the public officials who are in charge, based on the structure of government, and they hold power, and a constitution defines that power. Most nations around the world exist with a government that has a constitution that establishes a republican form of government orchestrated by democratic processes. The rest of the adjectives to describe the government are typically in addition to this, such as monarchy, oligarchy, aristocracy, and dictatorship, but most nations have elected officials who represent the will of the people, a democratic republic. Anyway, now we have divided power between the structure of government due to a constitution and political parties' interaction with government officials. This has divided the power into two parts, and a third component can be added, which is that of the voice of the individual. Whether that voice works in unison with others and is spread through which medium, such as by vote or oral discourse, it does not matter. It is the people or citizens who comprise a major power source. Although not the cause of a division of power among three or more entities, the will of the people being added to a constitution and political arena is best shown when true democracy is left to flourish. The Constitution provides a limited structure for governing, and political parties are allowed to dissolve and come to fruition freely. Nations like the United Kingdom, France, and at times Israel experience shifts in coalition making and breaking that so freely allows for the transfer of political power to be leveled more evenly. The people vote and choose how and why their government does what it does, and the passions of democracy can be viewed in the legislatures, the press, and openly in the streets and among the public. That is, until a dictatorship or militaristic movement takes hold of the government, and then the democracy is reduced back to simple majority-minority circumstances. With the correct protections outlined in the Constitution defining how the government will separate powers, a political party that is helpful in the background of the political process, and a populace that is happily willing to work for a better society creates the outcomes of democracy that have allowed the United Kingdom, France, and Israel to survive and at times flourish. All of these countries have political power spread among changing political parties and are breeding grounds for finding key solutions to experiments in liberty, justice, and individual rights. How does having multiple dynamic political parties devoted to and reflective of the will of the people interact with the power separation provided for by the foundations of a government, typically laid down by a constitution or other document? The foundations themselves determine the process for facilitating the democratic process that creates the need for political parties. This is seen in a single party and two-party systems as well, but is most observable in one where democracy is truly free to flow. So, power vacuums have been described in the sense of parties, where philosophical ideologies of liberal, conservative, and socialists inhabit them typically, and power vacuums exist for the officials whose positions are outlined in the Constitution. Another vacuum, and even further, another pit exists in the form of the voice of the people en masse, which is filled by popular discourse. People need to be able to organize and group in order to gain a majority who agree on a beneficial resolution. Everyone has a voice, which explains further why democracy is an experiment in individual liberty, and these voices are able to unify into a grander voice in order to sway a populace. The actual change comes about in the government institutions outlined in the structure of the government, and political parties are always present to maintain a smooth coordination between movements of the people and the officials who institute law. Anyway, in summary, these are musings and examples of how power can be divided into one, two, or three or more power vacuums, which can be split into another third dimension of one, two, or three or more power vacuums, further split into another one, two, or three that work in congruence with each other to form either a pillar or a pyramid of power. Altogether, and put into a cluster, spheres of political influence come from political boundaries, an executive leader, a constitution, political parties, and the will of the people. These spheres can also be viewed as spectrums of power, each and all spectrums of power converging on a single point, the center of the sphere of influence. On executive functions, again, we will be using the United States and its Constitution as an example to explain the executive functions of government. The United States President is the head of the executive branch and is also recognized as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and is the head of state. He or she is responsible for appointing and leading the leaders of the various federal agencies as well as executing all laws written by Congress. The cabinet, appointed by the president, as well as federal agency leaders, are solely responsible for executing all laws, hence comprising the executive branch. The position of President of the United States was created under Article 2 of the Constitution. As previously discussed, he or she oversees the executive branch of government. The 15 executive departments are led by members of the President's cabinet, and they carry out the administration of the federal government. Despite the majority of the executive branch falling under the departments of the cabinet members, the president is in charge of various federal agencies themselves. There are, in addition to the departments and federal agencies, numerous independent federal commissions. And of course, there's also the executive office of the president, which includes aides, staff, and other positions directly committed to the president's needs. The president can veto legislation submitted by Congress or sign bills into law, even though this can be potentially overridden. The president also has the ability to sign and negotiate treaties with foreign entities, which are ratified by the Senate. However, executive orders can also be implemented by the president, and pardons and clemencies for felonies may be extended as well. The president must also give a State of the Union in order to provide information on the nation to Congress. This is tradition, but the issuance of information regarding the state of the nation is mandatory. There are multiple qualifications that must be met in order to be elected president, such as being the ripe age of 35, and the president is elected by an electoral system that involves an allotted number of votes per state based on their combined number of representatives and senators to Congress. The president is only allowed up to 2 4-year terms and lives in the White House. The vice president is arguably the second most powerful member of the federal government, and his or her most important responsibility is to be ready to assume the presidency at a moment's notice. The vice president is also elected by the Electoral College, the same as the president. The vice president serves as president of the Senate and is therefore responsible for casting the deciding vote. In the case of a tie, typically the vice president does not preside over the Senate, rather a member of that chamber is decidedly in a leadership position. Other duties performed by the vice president are largely at the discretion of the sitting president, and he or she lives in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. The executive office of the president is charged with making influential decisions daily. They support the president with everything he or she needs for governing the nation and have responsibilities that vary from foreign trade interests to communicating the president's messages domestically. The executive office of the president is headed by the White House Chief of Staff and usually contains many of the president's closest advisors, some of whom require Senate confirmation. Some portions of the executive office of the president include the National Security Council and the White House Communications Office. Many positions and responsibilities of this office change regularly and in relation to each president's decided needs. There are several other offices besides the executive office of the president that help the White House function properly. The cabinet consists of an advising body of persons that include the heads of executive departments. They are confirmed by the Senate after being appointed by the president. These are some of the most powerful people in the nation. Besides the Attorney General, all of these federal agency heads are designated as secretary. There are 15 executive departments listed as follows: Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, the Interior, Justice, Labor, State, Transportation, the Treasury, and Veteran Affairs. And I'm going to write a whole bunch more about executive functions. Okay, on legislative functions. The legislative branch of the United States government was established under Article 1 of the Constitution. It established a House of Representatives and a Senate, which compose Congress. The ability to declare war and conjure legislation, as well as the possibility of rejecting presidential nominees, is awarded to this branch of government. Congress also has very significant investigative powers. The House of Representatives is comprised of 435 congresspeople, and the Senate is composed of 100 members. Resident commissioners and delegates, of which there are 6, are included in the House of Representatives, elected by the House of Representatives, and amongst the representatives is the Speaker of the House, who presides over the House. Some of the most important sole roles of the House are the ability to originate budget bills, impeach federal officials, and in case of an electoral college tie, they are able to elect the president. Members of the House are elected every 2 years, and there are 2 senators from each state. Senators' terms are 6 years, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Both representatives of the House and senators can be re-elected an unlimited number of times. Again, the vice president is also president of the Senate. Many appointments made by the president are confirmed and consented upon by the Senate. The Senate also reviews and consents to treaties. However, the House of Representatives must be committed to all foreign treaties, as well as the vice president. It is extremely important to recognize that the House of Representatives and the Senate must approve of identical bills for legislation to pass, making them also extremely similar in practice. There are numerous actions that must take place for Congress to pass a bill and send it to the President for ratification, even if it may possibly be sent back as previously discussed. The three branches of the United States government are considered co-equal. However, Congress has extremely significant powers at its disposal. Since Congress is the vast and major head of the legislative branch, it is the only body that can create or change legislation. The Constitution vests all legislative power in Congress, and the regulations issued by federal agencies are almost always at the discretion of Congress, which created the laws first. Congress even has the power to enact laws that are necessary and proper for the function of the United States government, regardless of the government branch it relates to. A portion of Congress's responsibilities includes fixing the United States government's budget, of course, but more importantly, essential government services are financed through the authority of Congress to levy taxes and impose tariffs. Congress may also borrow financial aid if there's not enough to finance the budget. Specified funds may be mandated to fund earmarks or particular projects deemed important. Large investigative powers are extended to both members of Congress, and testimony and evidence may be compelled as well. Much time is spent by Congress on hearings for the purpose of investigation by committees. An individual can be held in contempt of Congress for not properly appeasing a subpoena or being summoned. The drastic ability to declare war officially is held by Congress. The methodology of war will be discussed at length in a following section. A critical role of Congress is also the oversight of the executive branch of the United States government. This is a check on the president's discretion and his or her ability to implement and enforce laws and regulations. Hearings are a commonplace way to conduct government oversight, and there are designated committees in both chambers of Congress devoted to fulfilling this accountability-related process. GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, is another organization maintained by Congress for the purpose of ensuring government oversight. And of course, the executive branch has its own inspectors general to report and audit government agencies to which they are attached. At the beginning of the legislative process, a bill is proposed and introduced to Congress. The only possible path for introduction originates from a chamber member. Following this introduction, a bill will be submitted to the appropriate committees and subcommittees for review and changes. The bill starts in the subcommittee, typically, and is then moved further to the full committee after careful consideration and revisions. This process may include interviews and investigations to gather relevant information, and committees can even file subpoenas to gather sufficient testimony. If the full committee votes to accept a bill, it is then moved to Senate or House of Representatives leadership to be placed on the docket. The timing of the placement on the calendar is dependent upon the importance and how pressing the bill is to the nation. The timing varies widely. Eventually, the bill will be considered by the chamber in which it originated. The House of Representatives and the Senate may have very different processes for debating bills as well. The House of Representatives debate process is structured firmly and limited, while the Senate is, for the most part, unstructured and unlimited. For example, filibusters may be implemented in the Senate. Once debating in either chamber has been completed, the bill is passed by a simple majority. Before a bill is sent to the president to be signed or vetoed, it must be approved and passed by both the chambers of Congress. There is a concrete process involving members from both chambers to create identical bills among them to be voted on, depending on where the bill originated. It is either signed by the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate, then the bill is sent to the President. If the President chooses to sign the bill into law, it is then amended into the statutes at large. In contrast, if the President disagrees with the bill, he or she may choose to veto it. This possible veto may be overridden by Congress, which involves a supermajority vote, 2/3 from each chamber. There is another type of veto. Rather than traditional, this involves whether Congress is in session or not. If Congress is in session and the President delays signing a bill for a longer period than 10 days, the bill will automatically become law. If Congress adjourns or is not in session by the end of the 10-day period, then the bill ends without becoming law, and it may not be overridden. This practice is called a pocket veto. Legal doctrine is the general term for the creation, amending, and administration of a code of laws. Legal doctrine is part of legislation, and legislation works congruently with judgment and judicial doctrine. Creating legislation includes research and in-depth analysis of past laws, judgments, and interpretations, and writing a presentable and implementable charter of laws and regulations. Amending laws requires interpreting the will of those affected, providing reasons for changes, and predicting future consequences. Both creating and amending laws requires an approval process by a governing body. All laws necessitate administrative duties and continuing support, especially when large agencies are used for regulation and when financial resources are continually needed and assessed. And finally, judgments are handed down by judges at different levels of government, and they provide the rulings, limitations, legality, and interpretations of all legislation. This affects all stages of the codes of laws from creation to continual administration. Research and preparation for the making of a code of laws or a single law in particular determines the validity and utility of a law. It is imperative to have informed lawmakers who are current about a subject and to place more overall knowledge into legislation. This task can be undertaken by all forms and areas of lawmaking bodies, but dedicated research teams working in a coordinated fashion will provide the greatest result. Sources and first-hand accounts, statistics and demographics, consultation and advising are all forms of research performed. Reports are typically prepared and organized into a presentable product and then sent to a governmental body for approval. It is important to maintain legality in the creation of legal doctrine, as there is usually a device that outlines foundational structures of the legal system. Also, as a standard in most forms of society, legal doctrine is based on other legal doctrine. Therefore, an in-depth analysis of similarities between laws must be conducted, and this will continue throughout the life of the legislation. Not only must similar legislation be analyzed, but previous judgments and interpretations must be accounted for, discourse from judges must be adhered to, and precedent from past rulings must be considered. It is interesting to note the sway interpretations of original intent and the continual growth of laws have on future creation of legal canon. The final product of the creation of laws is an established and presentable charter or document of laws and a support system to be implemented as necessary. The support system consists of the regulations, manpower, and financial appropriations that keep the laws relevant and in effect. The actual product of law creation must be outlined in detail, and issues and circumstances being anticipated must be reflected in the language of the product itself. Lastly, the law must be established on a recordable medium for future reference and for the sharing of the exact definition of the law. The process for approving a law or list of laws is another beast itself, and where political arguments and negotiations happen. The whole study of politics and the opinions of the people is included in the voting and approval of legislation, and its presence is observable throughout every mechanism involved in the creation, amending, and maintaining of legal doctrines. But from a practical standpoint, politics ceases to sway each legal doctrine once enough time has been accumulated by a legal principle and may not affect bi- or multi-partisan agreements for new legislation. Legal doctrine must be implementable, and the terms for doing so may be contained in the doctrine itself, but likely also have organizational structures that maintain an existing form of government requirement. This legal doctrine, as stated, cannot contradict overarching structures of government. It may even play a role in forming or amending the models of government that allow the facilitation of lawmaking. Since time continues to pass and circumstances change, laws continuously need to be made and regulations put into place. Changes to these laws and regulations must occur. However, knowledge of the problem and the effects of adoption are not easily understood. Therefore, the amendment process necessitates the same reverence as all legislative duties. The procedure for adopting initial legislation and amendments as final institutions of law does not matter as long as the result is the final adoption. Amending legislation requires understanding the will of the people and is typically a result of unhappiness by those affected or dysfunction in the law itself, hurting the community, or the laws proving burdensome on some other facet of society. Stakeholders of the amending legislation provide reasons for an amendment which are considered by the legislature, and the process for amending laws begins. Deciding on where the problem with a law lies and identifying specific corrections is a process that requires the same techniques of research as in the original creation of the law. Reasons for changing a law are often discussed both openly and behind closed doors by legislators, and progress is made within the political containment of the legislative body, meaning once a proposal for change has been made, approval is limited to those with the power to actually approve. Acknowledgement that consequences are the aim of changing legal doctrine and that circumstances and the final consequences are widely unpredictable is imperative to the legal process. The resulting consequences of actions taken by the legislative body must be measured in terms of improving or damaging already existing societal functions. Also, largely, changing laws and therefore imposing changing standards on those governed will create resistance, which causes the amendment process to become cumbersome and time-consuming. Amendments require the same attention to detail as the initial law manifestation and thus comprise a significant portion of legislation. As mentioned, final adoption of legislation, which holds the lawmakers liable, is another beast itself, and the process undertaken, determined by the form of government, is where legislation is broadened or narrowed to the basic definition of rules. Every legislative action must have supportive accompaniments to maintain, monitor, and regulate any institutional needs of the legal code. Administration is left to agencies or other bureaucratic entities established by lawmakers, and their responsibilities are outlined in the legal document itself, or at least prescribed by the doctrine and constrained and unconstrained by it. The functions of a legislative body will likely have to cooperate and be a signal and liaison between an enforcing power and the will of the people. So, for example, coordination has to exist down the line from voters to lawmakers to a president, or similarly from commoners to lawmakers to a king. This duty of interpreting signals from law-abiding individuals to governing persons is facilitated through the administration created by laws. Laws establish regulatory institutions to administer themselves, and this requires maintenance and monitoring over time. Reports on the effectiveness of laws should be reviewed periodically, and if the agency institutions are not able to adapt to the changing requirements, small amendments must be made. There is a continual loop requisite for the best results in most processes: design, implementation, and then monitoring. Monitoring, like lawmaking and enforcing, requires manpower, which must be ordained by the law that the monitors are monitoring. Okay, on to judicial functions. The judicial system works in tandem with the legislative system, and in some versions of governance, they are observably inseparable. Lawyers, judges, and the courts comprise the judicial process on a localized basis, but it is the results, interpretations, and implications that make the judiciary a forceful entity when compared to legislating. The judiciary also performs executive functions by imposing punishments for law and regulation violations. And continuing from the legislative process, once a law has been openly passed by lawmakers and is formally processed by society, then the legislation may be judged for its quality. An essential requirement is that it does not interfere with the overarching establishment of governance or the entity that created the legislature or judicial entities themselves. A law may also not interfere with any legislation stemming from a constitutional system, such as institutional creations, financial apportionments, or other miscellaneous residual effects of other laws. The legality of the law, but also the moral and ethical implications are considered when judging, and the decision to block or not block a mandate comes from individual judges. These judges are the agents of the judiciary and a necessary means for providing rules and constraints, as well as interpretations of all laws and regulations. Rulings on individual lawsuits are undertaken by all levels and various courts of the legal system. The legal system is focused on the courtrooms during individual trials. Often, there is an appellate system for reviewing previously tried cases, and cases in various governments are presented multiple times in the same or similar forms, but it is the judges that make the final ruling, or facilitate the legal system when a decision is made. Otherwise, the ruling is by a government official or a jury of the people. Rulings are also recorded and provide a chronological history of legal proceedings, their results, and their implications, all for the betterment of the judiciary and the knowledge of the judges. Limitations on legislation come from blocking laws on the basis of being illegal or interfering with past legislation. Limitations also come from regulations that are interpreted by judges as to their legality. Judges punish those who disobey regulations and may therefore perform executive functions to enforce established laws and legal principles. Judges may also preemptively halt legislation through an injunction, through administrative bureaucracy, or through untraditional political avenues. All of the abilities of the judicial branch are meant to constrain the citizens and the government from doing injustice or illegal activity. The Constitution outlines and establishes the judicial branch of the United States government in Article 3. Unlike the executive and legislative branches of government, the officials of the judicial branch are not elected by the general population. Rather, they are confirmed by the Senate after being appointed by the President. Congress is responsible for establishing the structure and functional process of the federal judiciary. For example, the number of Supreme Court justices is largely left to the discretion of Congress. Courts that are inferior to the Supreme Court are also left up to Congress. Congress has created the District Courts of the United States as well as the Court of Appeals for trying and reviewing federal cases. Impeachment by the House of Representatives and conviction by the Senate is required for removing federal judges. There is no fixed term for judges and justices of the court system, which supposedly prevents them from being swayed by political trends and movements of passion by the general public. They are inevitably meant to employ justice with only the law as their guide for going political concerns. In general, the jurisdiction of the federal court system is left up to Congress. Original jurisdiction, however, is applied to cases such as states against states, and this power cannot be removed by Congress. Courts are only able to try real cases in which harm has been done to an individual or group of individuals. If there were no effect on actual policy, then the courts would not hear a case. This means that they do not give advisory opinions regarding legal constitutionality. Federal courts do have the sole power to interpret legislation, apply it, and determine its constitutionality, though, and testimony and evidence can be compelled by the courts through subpoenas similar to Congress. Also, interpretation by the Supreme Court must be applied to cases tried in the inferior court system so that they are hence constrained. The absolute highest court in the United States is the Supreme Court and is required specifically by the Constitution, unlike the inferior courts. At different times, there have been various numbers of Supreme Court justices. This has been left to the discretion of Congress. As well, the justices of the Supreme Court are first nominated by the President and then confirmed through the Senate, and they hold their positions on the Supreme Court for lifelong tenure, unless impeached and convicted by Congress or they resign. Generally, the caseload of the Supreme Court is pointedly appellate or in the way of reversal and review of previous decisions or legislation. This high court is the final arbiter judicially regarding federal law in the United States. There are a few scenarios where the court has what is considered original jurisdiction. This includes cases dealing with diplomats and state-to-state controversies. It is perfectly possible and within the power of the Supreme Court to hear appellate legal questions. However, it is unusual for the Supreme Court to actually hold trials. The primary duty of the court lies in its power to interpret laws and retain the law's implications and applications and further interpretations. Precedents set by the Supreme Court must be upheld by all inferior courts. In almost every circumstance, the Supreme Court requires a writ of certiorari petition to the court in order for a case to be heard. It is customary to grant this writ if 4 out of the currently 9 members agree. A popular reason for granting cert is in the case of discrepancies amongst 2 or more appellate federal courts. Directly involved parties, as well as associates of the court, amicus curiae, are responsible for presenting cases to the Supreme Court. Arguments, which are typically oral in nature, are submitted to and reviewed by the justices to prepare for a fair and justifiable verdict. In the situation where a case involves the federal government, the United States is represented by the Solicitor General. The court's final opinion is given after the questions have been asked to relevant entities and careful consideration has been made. This process can take up to several months. Apart from establishing the judicial branch of government, Article 3 of the Constitution guarantees that an individual accused of a crime has rights to a fair trial by a competent judge and to a jury of the individual's contemporaries. There are several amendments to the Constitution that outline what protections to individuals who stand accused of a crime. These include a guarantee of life, liberty, or property, subject to legal due process and being protected from being tried for the same crime. Having a jury comprised of impartial members in a quick trial are additional rights, as well as the right to call and therefore cross-examine witnesses. Then, of course, there are the rights to representation and protections from self-incrimination, excessive financial burden, and punishments. Also included is the prevention of cruel or unusual punishments. Most of this is found in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Proceedings for criminals can take place in relation to either federal or state law, and an arrest by a law enforcement agent or officer is typically where the process begins. If a grand jury so chooses to indict an individual, then he or she will be formally brought before a judge, where a charge will be delivered. The possibility to enter a plea deal then becomes available. A defendant is able to formulate a legal argument for his or her case and reveal all the evidence available before trial, which will eventually be decided by a jury. If the defendant is found to be innocent of a crime and not guilty of misconduct, the charge against them will be dismissed. In contrast, the judge will determine the appropriate punishment for the crime if the defendant is found to be guilty. Besides criminal cases, there are also civil cases. Civil cases are dealings between organizations or individuals and typically do not involve arbitration by the state. Wrongdoing has the potential to be remedied by suits filed in civil courts. Civil cases are very similar in their proceedings to those of criminal court cases, and that trial takes place. A jury trial may be waived in either a civil or criminal case. The case is then decided by a judge, and the corresponding damages or punishments are handed down by him or her. Appealing a court decision is almost always possible, and in that situation sent to a higher court than that of the previous trial. This can come about when there are discrepancies in legal procedure or a legal error that affected the outcome of the case. What is called an appellate court is responsible for making a decision based on the facts of the discrepancy or error and does not procure additional evidence or listen to witness testimony. Usually, an appellate court does not override previous judgments unless the outcome was significantly disrupted by legal error. This is supposedly based on fact, and the findings of the appellate court must be clearly erroneous. In the occurrence of federal appellate trials, the appeals are decided upon by a panel of 3 judges. A brief is presented to the court, which is a document made in an attempt to persuade the judiciary that there was an error in the original trial. A contrary brief is also produced by the opposing party in order to persuade the court that the original trial was wholly correct in its proceedings, otherwise not affecting the outcome of the trial. Sometimes an appellate court may send a trial back to the originating level of courts for further proceedings, and in some cases, more judges may become involved in an attempt to review the trial. Finally, a litigant has the ability to file for a writ of certiorari, in which a plea to review the case is sent to the Supreme Court. However, the majority of cases that are sent to an appellate court are found to end there. The Supreme Court will typically only hear cases that bring new revelations to establish legal principles or when substantial changes to constitutional interpretation can be made.